On the outskirts of town, in a crumbling Victorian mansion left to rot under layers of ivy and dust, lived Mrs. Halloway. Or rather, she had once lived there, until one fateful Halloween night 5 years ago, when she vanished without a trace. The townsfolk said that Mrs. Halloway had practiced strange rituals, communing with spirits and even the dead. Some called her a witch, others claimed she was simply mad. But everyone agreed on one thing: since her disappearance, no one dared enter the mansion. That is, until Halloween night rolled around again, and Jamie, Ash, and Will decided to break that taboo. "It's just an old house," Jamie scoffed, shining his flashlight over the mansion's broken windows. "Nothing's gonna happen. It's probably full of rats and junk." Ash, slightly trembling, kept her eyes glued to the shadows. "That's what everyone says, right before they're taken." Will laughed, his voice a forced whisper in the thick, chilly air. "Taken by what, Ash? Mrs. Halloway's ghost?" But something about the place, its silence, the way the wind seemed to die as they approached, made the words ring hollow. As the three crept up the cracked stone steps, a crow perched on a nearby branch screeched, breaking the silence. Jamie cursed, laughing nervously as he pushed the front door, which groaned open. Inside, the air was thick, carrying a stench of decay and dust. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and furniture sat covered in sheets that looked like pale, shrouded bodies. Each step they took echoed, their breaths quick and shallow. "Let's split up," Jamie said, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. "Find something spooky for our Halloween video. Get a shot of any weird stuff." Ash shook her head but followed him into a large room. It was a grand parlor, where a piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed, cracked, and silent. A massive mirror on one wall reflected their ghostly figures back at them, stretched and distorted. They exchanged glances. As Ash's flashlight flickered, something caught her eye. Across the parlor, a narrow, creaky staircase led down into the darkness. "Maybe we shouldn't," Ash began, but Jamie was already heading toward the stairs, his curiosity overpowering his fear. "This'll make a killer video. Ash, Halloween night in Mrs. Halloway's house." Reluctantly, she followed him down, feeling the walls narrow around her, the air colder with each step. They reached the basement, a cavernous, damp room filled with relics, faded portraits, jars of preserved insects, and strange symbols scrawled on the walls in what looked like ash. But it was a mirror in the center of the room that drew their attention. This wasn't just any mirror, it was tall and narrow, with intricate, twisting patterns along the frame that seemed to pulse, as if alive. The surface, though dusty, shimmered with an unsettling sheen, as though it were watching them. "Dare you to look into it," Jamie taunted, laughing nervously. Ash hesitated, something deep inside warning her against it, but Jamie pressed closer, staring into his reflection. As he gazed, his face began to change. His eyes grew darker, his skin paler, until his features twisted into a sinister, mocking version of himself. The reflection sneered, lips curling in a cruel, knowing smile that wasn't his. Jamie staggered back, horrified. Did you see that?" Before Ash could answer, footsteps sounded on the floor above, slow, heavy, each step deliberate and dreadfully patient. They froze, breaths caught in their throats. Ash turned, but Will was nowhere in sight. "Will?" she called softly, though the echo of her voice only deepened the silence. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. Jamie gripped Ash's arm, his bravado crumbling. "This is messed up. Let's get out of here." They turned to go back up the stairs when they noticed the walls seemed to shift, pressing in on them, leading them instead down a twisting corridor that hadn't been there before. It was as if the house was alive, guiding them deeper within its shadows. The corridor led to a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood a table, and on it lay a book, a thick, ancient tome bound in leather and adorned with strange, arcane symbols. Next to the book was a small, silver key, and beneath it, a piece of parchment. Jamie picked it up, his hands shaking. Scrawled in elegant, looping script were the words, "Asterisk the hollow ones await. Feed them, or become them, asterisk." "What does that mean?" Ash whispered, her voice barely audible. But before Jamie could answer, they heard Will's voice, faint and desperate, calling from somewhere nearby. They turned, sprinting down another hallway as Will's voice grew louder, pleading, as if he were trapped. They burst into a grand dining room, but what they saw stopped them cold. At the head of a massive table sat a figure, head bent, hair disheveled. It was Mrs. Halloway, or what was left of her. Her face was a hollow, expressionless mask, and in her bony hands, she cradled a cracked, empty mirror. Her eyes, two dark voids, turned toward them, her mouth stretching in a grotesque smile. Jamie stumbled back, colliding with Ash, who was paralyzed with fear. Mrs. Halloway's voice, soft as a whisper, filled the room, though her mouth barely moved. "You've come to join the Hollow Ones." Ash felt a chill, deep and suffocating, as her body seemed to freeze. Jamie, panicked, grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. She looked back to see Mrs. Halloway rising, her hollow eyes fixed on them with unnatural hunger. In their frantic attempts to escape, Jamie remembered the key. He pulled it from his pocket and jammed it into a nearby door, twisting it desperately. The door creaked open, revealing not an exit, but a long corridor of mirrors. Each mirror showed distorted reflections of them, their faces twisted and hollowed. One by one, the reflections began to step out of the glass, their expressions cruel, their eyes dark and lifeless. They surrounded Jamie and Ash, mirroring their every move with deadly precision. As Ash reached for Jamie's hand, her skin grew cold, and she felt herself fading, her reflection pulling her in with a force she couldn't resist. Jamie's screams echoed, but they sounded faint, distant, as if he were miles away. The last thing Ash saw was her own empty, hollowed-out eyes staring back at her from within the glass. In the morning, when a group of teenagers dared to enter Mrs. Halloway's mansion for their own Halloween thrill, they found only the cracked mirrors, their surfaces still and silent. But if you looked closely enough, if you leaned in and listened, you could hear faint voices echoing from the glass, pleading, whispering, begging to be set free. To this day, no one speaks of what truly happened that Halloween night, but they say if you walk by the old mansion at midnight, you might see shadows moving behind the windows, shadows of those who entered and never returned.